Hello and welcome to Paul on Politics. They say truth is stranger than fiction, and that's certainly been the case in politics in the last few years. With the parties vying for our support in any way they can, they have a new weapon in their armoury: social media. But are they using it effectively? And if so, how? And with the advent of fake news, are voters getting properly informed, or are they being taken for a ride? And with just weeks to go before polling day, how is the campaign shaping up in Kent, and who's in the reckoning to win? And is there really any prospect of true blue Tory heartland changing colour? With me on the sofa to discuss these issues is Professor Tim Luckhurst of the Centre for Journalism at the University of Kent. Thanks for coming in, Tim. First, Isabel Miller reports on how campaigns are using social media to win over support.
In the 2015 general election, the Conservatives spent £1.2 million on Facebook advertising, compared to Labour, who spent £160,000. The importance of appealing to voters from their phone screens is rising, especially for those who are undecided and need that extra political nudge. Social media is set to play a major part in the run-up to the upcoming election in June, and could have the potential to sway voters.
Yeah, I think it can kind of inhibit democracy in that you don't get all of the information, you just get the information that they know that you're more likely to click on.
People who don't really go looking for the information, if it's just popping up on their newsfeed on Facebook or Twitter or something, then that's pretty much the only source that they've got.
You find out the president has done something, you're going to be I'm not going to vote for him really.
I think it can make a difference to any party that takes hold of, by the scruff of the neck and runs with social media.
Personally, I think it does, because I'm not very into politics. I don't do my own research. So what I see on social media like Twitter and stuff does influence me a lot.
Political parties are using social media more and more to target voters. Is this effective, or is it just intrusive? And is it really the best way to stay informed?
I think for people who are putting together election campaigns, social media affords them an obvious possibility of an incredibly increased demographic. I think the sense of intrusiveness, if you get a Facebook read or you get a tweet and you haven't solicited it and you're not entirely sure who it's come from, how they've targeted you, and indeed, is the information itself authentic, is it trustworthy? So those are a few initial pitfalls. You get little sound bites, you get quotes, and you think that you get the sense that you've been informed. Actually, you've just been targeted.
Isabel Miller for KMTV.
Well, Tim, a key point there: are we being targeted or are we being informed? Who's using social media well and who's using social media badly?
Well, we're both being targeted and informed. It depends how we consume information, where we get our information from. The political parties all see social media as a major opportunity to target us, and they're trying very hard. At the last election, Labour had hardly started to think about the use of social media. This time they've caught up. We think both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are spending more than £1 million each on targeted messages on Facebook. But there are two elections going on. Part of the electorate, mainly younger, does consume a lot of information from social media. Another chunk, older voters, often don't, and use conventional television news programmes, newspapers for their information. So if you like, there are two elections taking place, one slightly to the left on social media, one perhaps a little to the right on conventional media.
Of course, the evidence suggests that older people are more likely to vote. They're less likely perhaps to be on social media.
Well, that's certainly the assumption that's being made by both political parties, and there's a considerable amount of evidence for it. There's also some evidence that if older voters do use social media, they don't use it as a dominant way to think about politics. They're more likely to turn to conventional television news programmes, newspapers, etc. for that purpose. Whereas amongst a younger generation, those who are perhaps slightly less likely to vote, social media has enormous influence. They're spending hours per day on Facebook.
And does that mean, traditional trusted sources like newspapers, the BBC, are losing ground or being overlooked?
Without any doubt, for a younger generation, consumption of conventional media is a very, very unlikely source of political information. But that doesn't mean that they're getting a lot of political information elsewhere. It means that they're getting targeted messages on social media. And those targeted messages are designed to have one effect: to persuade them to vote the way that the party targeting them wants them to. They're not aiming to inform, they're aiming to influence.
Well, earlier we spoke to Megan Lucero from the Bureau Local, a part of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, who's partnered with a group called Who Targets Me to try and figure out how political parties are using Facebook ads to target people in the run-up to June the 8th. We asked her to explain how Facebook ads work.
So how it works is on Facebook has some very, very detailed data about users. So they know when you sign up, you put things like your age and your location in, but as you start to like things on Facebook or share things on Facebook, or even as you're sort of browsing, it's monitoring a lot of data about you. And it allows advertisers to target accordingly. So anyone can buy an ad and say, I want to target a certain demographic. And that could be people who like your page, but it can drill down to very, very detailed demographics around occupation or gender, age, or whatever that is. And so those kind of ads can be hugely powerful because they drop straight into your Facebook feed.
Well, that's how it works, supposedly. Who are the parties trying to target particularly?
They want, in particular, to contact floating voters in marginal constituencies. And what's going to be very interesting about this election is to see afterwards just how effective that was. We know that both of the major parties, and to a certain extent the Liberal Democrats too, are targeting real social media resources at trying to get to those floating voters in the seats they think they can win. Until it's over, we won't know how effective it's been, but it's certainly what they want to achieve.
And there aren't many marginal seats in Kent, but...
That's true.
Other than Facebook, there's obviously Twitter, and what's interesting as a journalist for me is you go into any newsroom these days and you'll see banks of screens with people casting an eye over Twitter. But actually it's Facebook which is reaching more people. Is Twitter just a kind of echo chamber for the punditariat?
It is largely an echo chamber for the punditariat. That's a very nice phrase, Paul. And the Labour Party learnt this to its great cost in 2015. Ed Miliband's campaign team thought that if they were getting lots of likes on Twitter, it meant that people were supporting them. In fact, it simply meant that their own core supporters were retweeting each other's tweets and giving expression of their support for the Labour Party. It told them nothing whatsoever about what was happening in the broader electorate. On the whole, at this election, Twitter's been very good fun for people who are interested in politics, but if you only watch Twitter, you'd think that the majority of the British public are going to vote Labour. Most of the tweets which are being shared are either slightly to the left or entirely neutral. There's a huge number of tweets about, for example, Labour's pledge to abolish university tuition fees. Well, this just shows you that young Labour supporters share tweets on Twitter.
And of course Twitter does have its pitfalls for politicians too. There's the infamous tweet that Emily Thornberry, now the Shadow Foreign Secretary, posted on Twitter during the campaign for the Rochdale and Stroud by-election. There are hazards, aren't there, in social media, and you can press the button a bit too quickly sometimes.
You certainly can. Indeed, there's a very important gentleman in the White House who seems to do it regularly, almost on a daily basis. But yes, Emily Thornberry in the Rochdale and Stroud by-election, what an enormous error to make. Interesting to see her rehabilitated, but I don't think she's going to be campaigning in Rochdale and Stroud somehow.
Well, we may not see many people campaigning in Rochdale. Which does indicate that perhaps journalists are looking sometimes in the wrong areas for stories. I think recycling information which is already known.
Well, there's an element of that certainly going on. Look, this election hasn't really taken off. We're in new territory. We're used to elections where we see people knocking on doors, delivering leaflets. We actually see a ground war fought in constituencies. At the moment in Kent, we're seeing very little of that. I don't know about you, but I haven't had a single candidate or party worker come to my door. I've only had one leaflet. When I talk to colleagues and friends, they say the same thing. The political parties may well be trying to use social media, but remember that there may be a reason for doing this which has got nothing whatsoever to do with strength. It's to do with the fact that you can use social media when you haven't actually got many members willing to go out and slog the pavements, to talk to people and to knock on doors. After all, we all know that in politics one of the most effective things you can do is actually talk to voters face to face. But in order to do that, you need volunteers prepared to go out and fight.
Well, which brings us to a very interesting development this week involving one of the Conservative candidates in Kent, Gordon Henderson, and there has been a tradition in election campaigns for hustings meetings to take place in church halls and community halls and in different places. He's taken out an advert saying that he's not prepared to take part in any hustings, but is inviting his constituents to come and see him at one-to-one meetings. That seems remarkable.
Yeah, but you see, this is another product of our modern age. Politicians use social media because they believe that they can cut out the middleman.
Well, Gordon Henderson doesn't use any social media.
No, but that's my point. He's not using social media. He's trying to achieve the same effect that social media achieves by another mechanism. He's trying to speak directly to only to people who agree with him in circumstances which he can control. In the past, politicians who wanted to address the electorate needed to speak to journalists, speak to newspapers, appear on television, or do a public meeting. Now they think they can just control it themselves. I think it's profoundly misguided. I don't think people will be at all impressed by Gordon Henderson's decision only to see the people who want to see him in private in circumstances which he can control. That's not about debate, it's not about public engagement, it's not about being open to being questioned.
Well, you know, politicians have a reputation for wanting to be in control of everything in any case, don't they?
But it's becoming easier and easier for them to do that, and this is one of the things that I think we should seek to oppose, that politicians should be held up to scrutiny, they should be compelled, if possible, to debate with each other. They should have their arguments tested in a public forum and not simply by people who agree with them.
Well, interestingly, we posted that advert that he put out on Twitter, and you can imagine the reaction was, you know, people very disdainful of the idea that he wasn't prepared to meet his constituents.
I'm not remotely surprised. Not a great idea. Perhaps not as big a mistake as Emily Thornberry's at a previous occasion, but perhaps roughly comparable.
And briefly, you know, what do you make of Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn not taking part in debates? That's, you know, you can perhaps understand why in some ways, but it's disappointing, isn't it, not to have the two main party figures?
I think it's a huge shame that we haven't established in this country a tradition as robust as the one that exists in the United States, where those who want to lead the country have to face each other in live debate with a mediator who is genuinely objective, a journalist, not one of their friends, and they have to defend their case in a way that the public can really scrutinise. I think it's frankly shameful that neither the Prime Minister nor the Leader of the Opposition are going to be involved in those debates, that they're not going to come head to head, and I think in a democracy we should require them to do that sort of debate.
Well, we did ask Megan Lucero whether social media does target just young people or if there's a more even spread across the board. So let's hear what she has to say before we turn to the campaign in Kent.
Yeah, I mean, actually, our average age when we first took a snapshot of it was kind of their late 30s, so a bit higher than we would have thought. And it's amazing. We've got quite older populations in the database, but not as many, you know, as we'd like, because actually our piece out today showed Best for Britain, which is the campaign group run by Gina Miller, has two ads they put out, and they looked identical. They have a quote and a individual. We found one was picked up by a young woman, I think she was early 20s, and one was picked up by a woman in her 50s. And the picture of the younger one is a young woman, the one is an old woman, and they were put out at the exact same time. So, I mean, it's just kind of, you know, it enabled us to show how that's happening, how the targeting is happening. So yeah, the more the better, really.
Well, apologies for the slightly poor sound quality on that clip. Moving on. Now, back in 2015, you couldn't venture out in Kent without the probability of bumping into some political VIP on the campaign trail. But 2 years on, it seems that political tumbleweed is rolling through the county, with the main parties giving us the cold shoulder. In fact, you might be hard-pressed to even know there was an election campaign going on. Tom Fiore took to the streets of Rochester to see if we're suffering from voter fatigue.
I'd like to see the immigration slowed down. I think there's getting too many people. You know, I mean, the thousands that have come in, hundreds of thousands. It's got to make a difference to the English way of living.
Obviously, immigration towards Dover. There's a lot of people coming in. Obviously, that's a big problem in Kent these days. So it's something that probably needs to be resolved. And also the tuition fees. It's big problem. Like obviously Labour are trying to get rid of tuition fees. Obviously, it is something that everyone wants, but is it realistic? Probably not.
Housing, definitely, and the hospital facilities, definitely, for this area.
Mm-hmm. So you think in Medway more in general, there's a lack of.
I don't blame them. You know, I think Medway's good, but they need more facilities and more staff.
Well, Tim, there does seem to be a huge contrast between this campaign in Kent and the one we saw in 2015. I've not had a single leaflet. You were telling me you've not had a single leaflet. it's a bit of an invisible campaign, isn't it?
It does feel like a very invisible campaign. I think part of it's to do with the state of the opinion polls. In 2015, there were several genuinely marginal seats here in Kent, particularly the 3 seats in the Medway towns, all of which Labour regarded as potential targets. It looks now as if the Labour Party has almost reached the conclusion that it doesn't have a chance of winning seats here in Kent. It's concentrating its resources in the Midlands, the north of England. It's trying to win seats which would in the past have been regarded as bedrock, but which it now thinks are vulnerable to Conservatives. That in itself is an indication of the state of British political opinion. But even the Conservatives, who appear to think that they're cruising to victory, seem to think that the best way to cruise to victory is to do very little. You would genuinely think on the streets of Kent, in our communities, that nothing much is going on. A little bit of activity in a few locations, some of it almost profoundly misguided. I, for example, have seen evidence of Liberal Democrats' activity in Rochester and Stroud.
Wow, now, that's a first for a long time.
It's an exciting thing to see, and I'm delighted to see political activism taking place. But Liberals in Rochester and Stroud, they're not going to win.
But they have to start somewhere, don't they? I mean,
they do, but I think Maidstone might be a better idea.
Well, we'll see. They had high hopes, of course, in Maidstone in 2015,
they
and
did.
They were shattered rather brutally on the night.
But they've done well on the district council, and they think it's potentially a seat in which they can make progress. Whether that will turn out to be true, I wonder.
What's interesting for me in this election is that actually the 3 main parties are presenting very distinctive programmes actually in terms of their manifestos. It's the first time that I can remember that we've not been complaining about the fact that you couldn't put a cigarette paper between the 3 main parties in terms of the commitments. We've got the Lib Dems proposing the legalisation of cannabis, second referendum, the renationalisation of industries from Labour. So there's quite distinctive programmes there. Shouldn't that be generating more interest?
Perhaps it should be generating interest, but I think what it's designed to do, particularly from Labour and the Liberal Democrats, is to make sure that they hang on to and solidify their core loyalist vote. Labour has produced a manifesto which will be absolutely a delight to committed socialist supporters of the Labour Party, committed Social Democrats or the left of the Labour Party. These are iconic policies, the renationalisation of major state industries. That will really appeal to their loyalists. It won't appeal outside that loyal group. The Liberal Democrats appear to be doing the same thing. Very pro-European, despite the referendum result, intensely committed to some of the policies which in the past they would have been called eccentric for adopting, as you say, the legalisation of cannabis, and that's given the Conservatives the freedom to be almost depressing in their manifesto. They're not going to make a commitment not to raise income tax, not to raise national insurance. They're going to abandon the triple lock-on pensions. They're going to tell us that we essentially have to pay for our own care when we are elderly. They can do that, they think, because they think they're so far ahead that they can afford to tell the truth.
Do you think it's depressing because they want to repudiate Cameron's living in the land of sunshine and so forth?
I think it's the confidence, perhaps it's the overconfidence of a party which believes it's going to win and believes that it can therefore get its retaliation in first. It can tell the truth now so that no one can accuse it of betraying promises later.
If Labour has a shocking result, where does it go? Do we see a split in the party and a new movement developing?
I wonder. There is clearly a move amongst Jeremy Corbyn's loyalists to say that he has been elected leader of the party and that he can stay on whatever he achieves. His opponents are setting a very basic threshold. They're saying he's got to win more seats than Ed Miliband won in 2015 if he's going to remain. After all, Jeremy Corbyn described that result as a disaster. If he does less well himself, how can he possibly remain in office, is the argument put forward by those who believe he should be replaced.
And final question, Tim, what do you think the Conservative majority is going to be?
I think we'll have a Conservative majority of more than 100 seats in the House of Commons. I don't predict that because I want it to be the case. I'm entirely politically neutral, but I think that that's where the polls suggest we're going.
Okay, well, the clock is against us as usual. We'll find out on June the 8th what the results are, but that's all from us at Paul on Politics. Thanks to Tim for coming into the studio. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, you can catch up on all the latest political news in Kent by logging on to kentonline.co.uk or listening to KMFM, and keep an eye out for my daily Paul on Politics newsletter so you can keep informed in the run-up to June the 8th, which is affording me no sleep whatsoever. Thanks for watching.